All right, I might call us all back to order. Thank you all for coming back in, and it was so fantastic to hear that hum across the room just as everyone was chatting, and yeah, it was great. I'm going to invite Dr. Sally Bryant, who I think for this organisation in particular needs no introduction. So Sally is currently our honorary research fellow, but also our first science manager, and has been critical to this organisation, our science, and remains so today. So.
The vintage jacket. You know, it's a real privilege to be here today. It's also a privilege to see Kath in this role. Handing the baton was a fine thing. It's also a privilege to understand about legacy and seeing some of the results from monitoring and other work. You understand that you leave your mark and others pick up and take it further. It's also exciting to hear about new research, and my job now is to introduce 6 speakers for the next session, 8 minutes each. 4 of the speakers are based on TLC reserves or working with TLC on projects, and the final 2 speakers are Bird Conservation Fund recipients. So the first speaker we have is Alejandra Zorilla. I haven't met Alejandra, so please welcome her. She is the first of our 3 salt marsh talks based at the new Sloping Main Reserve. And the title of Alejandra's work is Bird Distribution and Habitat Preferences in Tasmanian Salt Marsh Wetlands. Welcome.
Thank you. And as mentioned, my name is Alejandra. I'm working at UTAS doing my PhD. This is my 3rd year, and I'm supervised by Professor Barry Brook, by Dr. Vishnu Prahalad, and by Dr. Jessie Butel. And I'm going to be talking about birds in salt marshes. This is fast. Okay, just to give you a little bit of context, Australia has 67 Ramsar sites, which means that they are part of the International Treaty to Protect and Conserve Wetlands, of which 10 are located in Tasmania. But why are salt marshes so important? Apart from the fact that they support amazing biodiversity, they are also good to improve water quality. They act as buffers against storms. They are also good at carbon sequestration. They create amazing recreation properties. But in my case, and my favorite, is that they are an amazing laboratory to make science. But knowing that there's very little information about, and there's very little body of literature in regards to salt marsh birds in Australia, and most importantly in Tasmania, with only a few papers being published, of which pretty much all of them are published by Vishnu. So what am I doing? It's a big project. This is only a part of one of my chapters in which I'm trying to characterize the bird communities between and within the salt marshes in 3 salt marshes located in southeast Tasmania. These 3 salt marshes are Richmond, Marion Bay, and Sloping Main, and they all have very different landscape context, with one of them being a very degraded salt marsh, the other one being a salt marsh that has already gone through a restoration process, and the other one being a Sloping Main, which is Burden's Marsh, part of TLC property. And it is a salt marsh that is inside our reserve of around 670 hectares, if I'm correct, which is inside a bigger conservation area of around 2,020 hectares. And why is this salt marsh so important for me, or why do I want to work here? Well, it has very high conservation values, including amazing vegetation structure with high connectivity between the salt marsh and the dunes. So at the west of the salt marsh is that your left side, on your left side, is the beach, and then you have the dunes, you have the salt marsh, and then next to it, you have this amazing preserved forest that allows connectivity between the salt marsh for species to move around. So we are talking about not only birds moving in between inside and outside the marsh, but also a lot of mammals. And this is how Burden's March looks like. Most of the year it's quite dry. So on my left-hand side, so probably your right, that's how I normally see it. I have divided my survey into sessions. So I'm only surveying in the drier months to account for the weather. But hopefully it's looking like that, quite wet at the moment, which I'm very excited to go and survey in October again. And what have I learned at the moment? Well, we have 36 bird species present. That's a little video of a, it's not a flame robin, it's the other one. A scarlet, thank you, people. So we have 36 bird species. Some of them, like the scarlets and the flame robins and the fairy wrens and forest ravens, are present throughout the marsh. So we see them in all of our point counts, but they're not the most abundant. They are all in quite low numbers. But the most abundant, and the crown goes to our beautiful European goldfinch, which, if you have heard it sing, it's beautiful. And it's only present at the north portion of the Sal Marsh. And in really high numbers, I've counted groups of 80, 90 individuals, to the point that I have had to stop counting because I'm afraid to double count. But what does that mean? What's my goal with this? So, and this is only an example. My goal is to understand what is the distribution of these species and what factors of the landscape and at a site level are affecting this distribution. So why am I seeing all this very big group of European goldfinches up north at Burdens, none of them in the south, but a lot of very well spatially distributed, for example, scarlet robins, but only in groups of 2 or 3. So what is giving us that spatial pattern? What is influencing the makeup of the bird community? And at the moment, as you can see, there's no, I haven't mentioned shorebirds because they are not in season, and I haven't had the pleasure to see them at Burdens, but I have had the pleasure to count shorebirds at my other sites. So it will be very interesting to compare how the landscape influences all these different birds and how can we learn, or what can we learn in the terms of our landscape and site structure. So my ultimate goal is to be able to tell people like Tasmania Conservancy what in their landscape of their properties is affecting their populations of Saltmarsh birds, not restricted only to shorebirds, which in most cases, when you mention Saltmarsh birds, people go immediately to shorebirds. We forget that the makeup of these communities is more complex and includes woodland birds that also move like across the Saltmarsh and use the space. So that's kind of what I'm up to. And I'll leave you with the next person presenting. Thanks.
Our next speaker hardly needs introduction at all, Mr. Saltmarsh, Vishnu. Vishnu's been flying the flag for salt marshes for decades. He's highly regarded and highly renowned. We look forward to your talk, Vishnu.
Thanks for that glowing introduction, Sally. So I do want to talk about salt marsh. And I guess a bit of an introduction to this talk is that a lot of the work we do, not just me, but also more broadly in the salt marsh community, is literally spineless. Specifically, we've got 25% of salt marshes in Australia. The world's population of salt marshes is in Australia. But the number of studies on mammals in salt marsh that are stories with the spine are 2, and that's the 2 you're looking on the screen there. And that's the 2 studies that I'm going to be talking about. One that's in the final stages of publication with John and Jamie Kirkpatrick, and another one which is under prep with Kenji, Jesse, and Barry from Natural Sciences at UTAS, but also the data from that project is going to be feeding into Alejandra's PhD. Right. So there's a lot of things that are happening in salt marshes, and we've been looking at, what do we know well? What do we need to know in order to manage these ecosystems? So I guess there are several gaps, which I've indicated there in terms of the yellow highlight. We need to know more about fish, and that was the focus of Violet Harrison. They has now completed PhD, so we know a lot about fish. We also need to incidentally know more about birds, as Alejandra was just alluding to. So Alejandra's PhD is directly targeted at that. But mammals, yes, mammals have always been, everyone says, well, there's mammals in salt marsh. So what? It's almost like, it's not a factor to be considered in terms of salt marsh research. And I'm asking the question, is that really the case? And especially in Tasmania, where we have mammals everywhere and salt marshes everywhere, and you see them all the time, we should be asking questions. And that's precisely what these two studies are looking into. And by the way, there's also algae there, but no one bothers about algae, so we'll just leave it as it is. So this is another way of looking at the, if you like, the landscape of salt marsh. We obviously want to know as much about this ecosystem as possible. So we're filling in these gaps, and the focus now for us to also fill in the gap in relation to mammal research, but also fly the flag for mammals in terms of salt marshes across Australia and also globally as well. We do, like I said, we do know that there's a lot of mammals in salt marsh, and everywhere I'm flushing mammals as I go into salt marshes. This is a fantastic example here in Ringarooma River, which is part of the Ramsar site. You walk across the creek. I recommend going at low tide and checking the tides as you go in. And there are these hundreds of kangaroos and wallabies sitting at the back, and just absolutely magnificent animals, and also a lot of birds. And that's precisely what we don't know about, but we always see in the landscape. There's also, we know that they're not just hanging out there and feeding, obviously. We know that they're also nesting there. This is Wombat Barrow in Long Point, which is a TLC property, which is the largest salt marsh in Tasmania. Right, so study one. So what we did in study one was to just say, well, let's just look at two sites. So what we're going to do is to say, what are the mammals here in these two sites, which are vastly distinct, as you can see there, Orielton Lagoon. There's hardly any landscape feature there by way of trees, highly cleared landscape. And the one next to that is Marion Bay, where you sort of have half the landscape still intact in terms of native habitat. So we did camera trapping here. And also we were looking at the growth of the native salt marsh shrub, Tecticonia arbuscula, which is a habitat-forming shrub. So these shrubs are coming back after degradation by grazing. So we want to see if grazing is actually holding the plant back in terms of its recovery. And if it is, then we need to be able to maybe control the grazing or even get rid of rabbits and hares, which we know there are in this landscape. So that's the study. So I'm just going to touch on the mammal part here, given time constraints. So we did about 90 trap days in Orielton Lagoon, spread across all the 4 seasons, and also in Marion Bay. And incidentally, yes, there are a lot of animals here, and you can see that there, and you can also see them grazing actively, like the rabbit in Orielton Lagoon. There's also hares. We picked up hares as the first record of hares in salt marsh in Australia. While we see them all the time, I'm talking about published records here. Which sometimes that's what counts when people are looking at these things across the world. There's possums, and yes, there are cats there. Unfortunately, the cats are everywhere. Incidentally, also in salt marsh, including in Orielton Lagoon, which is an internationally recognized site for birds and bird conservation. And what we did find was that there were lots and lots of pademelons in Marion Bay, and I'll get to the findings here. This is a quick snapshot of the findings. What you see here, just look at the two colors, right? So we know what landscape fragmentation does to species compositions. This is theory, and the theory is indicated below there. But we picked this up. In Orielton Lagoon, there was not a single incidence of native animals, no wombats, no pademelons, no wallabies, but they were everywhere in Marion Bay. So landscape plays such a huge role in terms of what we can then end up finding in the salt marsh. So we then expanded this work in the second study, and this was prompted by the grant we had for the blue carbon restoration site at Richmond, one of the 6 restoration sites across Australia for blue carbon. So we said we've got the funding for this, so we don't want to just look at this site. We want to try to sort of spread this around and actually pick 3 representative sites, which Alejandra spoke to. But just quickly, we did a pilot in Richmond, and what we found in Richmond was that yes, there are a lot of animals here, and we also picked up devils and obviously quolls as well. So just wanted to indicate to the friendly people at TLC here that salt marsh is quality habitat after all. Just to finish up, so the study too that's currently happening, we've got 70 camera traps installed. There are 3 different locations. So we're looking at what we can find inside the salt marsh, and we know this is affected by the landscape. So we're looking at what's also in the landscape so that we can characterize, again, as Alejandra said, what kind of broader landscape context do you need to support the kind of biodiversity, if you like, in the salt marshes that we have. So salt marshes are biodiverse in terms of how we look after them. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Beck Sheldon. Beck's from the Nature Glenelg Trust, and I know that's an organisation very close to Kath's heart. And Beck is going to talk us through her planned restoration for Burdens Marsh at Sloping Main Reserve. Welcome, Beck.
Thanks, Sally. My name is Beck Sheldon. I'm with Nature Glenelg Trust. We're a non-for-profit conservation NGO with some similarities to TLC. We've spent the last 12 months working with the TLC at Burdens Marsh on their new Sloping Main Reserve, getting to understand how hydrology drives ecology at that site and what are the legacy impacts from drainage and how we might go about restoring those wetlands and salt marsh over time. Am I doing wrong here? Oh. So Alejandra sort of introduced Burdens Marsh already. She stole some of my thunder, but it's on Tarakana, the Tasman Peninsula, home to the Pyjarame people. It was added to the reserve for TLC's Sloping Main Reserve in July, just over a year ago now, and increased that reserve area to over 660 hectares. And I guess TLC's interest in purchasing Burdens Marsh to add to the existing forest reserve was the important salt marsh communities that were on that site. It's quite a small catchment. It's only about 20 square kilometres, but most importantly, you can see there's 2 main streams feeding in from the south that deliver freshwater flows to the system. The western one of which provides probably 80 to 90% of the freshwater inputs. And it does have a tidal connection, as you can see in the northern end. So there's tidal flows. So, you know, like most salt marshes, that interplay between freshwater and saltwater. And along with that is it has a really variable water regime. You'll see some years it's incredibly wet, like 2021, those 2 to 3 consecutive years of La Nina, and in other years, 2019, I think, and the one just gone, it's really quite dry. And you can see that now only the northern section of the marsh really inundates frequently. So one of the first tasks we undertook was getting to map the drains on site. How has hydrology changed over time, and you know, when did these drains appear, and what impact have they had on the ecohydrology of this site? So you can see on the right, the different colours indicate at which periods in time the drains appeared in aerial photography or the records that are available to us. And those central beige coloured drains have actually been there since the 1820s, prior to Port Arthur. And the more brightly coloured drains have appeared in more recent decades. I think the blue and green in the 50s and 60s, and some of the yellow and red and pink only in the last couple of decades. You can see that there's a little drain on the outlet. It's actually a levee bank and a weir structure that's been put in there that's been regulating tidal inflows to this system since the early 90s. And you can see some the blue here draining an important deep freshwater marsh adjacent to Burdens Marsh called Turner's Lagoon, and some freshwater wetlands that are also along that trajectory that's drained into Burdens Marsh. And you can see another important aspect of the drainage is that a lot of the freshwater inflows are now directly diverted out to sea that don't even make it into Burdens Marsh. So it's had a bit of a double whammy in that it's not receiving its tidal inflows naturally, and it's not receiving a lot of the freshwater inflows that keep that the tidal outlet open to enable that exchange. And we map this timeline of change. I think it's really important to understand, and particularly for the TLC, when they purchase a site, what is the current trajectory of change at that site? What's the health of the ecosystem, and is it improving or decreasing over time? So we looked at when these changes appear, where they occurred, and what impact that's had on the ecohydrology over time. And as you can see, the site has quite an extensive change to hydrology over the last 150 years. And just to summarise the issues, we talked about there's now a levee and a control structure, which is number one on the outlet. There's drainage across all of the marsh itself in the central areas. There's that's number two. Number three, there's smaller freshwater wetlands, including Turner's Lagoon at the east there, that provide additional habitat that's all been drained. There's quite large, this is on the connecting property south of the TLC reserve, but there's some large freshwater wetlands that have been drained, and of course we've got that seaward drain draining the southern inflows out to sea. So how do you go about restoring this site and undoing some of that change to the ecohydrology? Basically, it's about trying to hold that water in the landscape more, get it, instead of flows coming in there and going straight out to sea, hold that water in the landscape. And largely it's really about restoring that natural hydrology, knitting back together that landform. As we know, in salt marshes are quite flat areas, so any change to microtopography has quite a large impact on the ecohydrology of those systems. And it was really important for the TLC, and it's something that's part of our restoration kind of objectives anyway, is to create systems where you're not needing to have ongoing maintenance or operational requirements. So we did look at a few different scenarios. We looked at quickly at a do nothing scenario. What would it mean if we actually left it alone and did nothing? It quickly became obvious to us that TLC were keen to embark on a restoration kind of outcome for this site. So then we looked to restore the actual reserve, and there are progressive steps that we've listed in a priority order to achieve that over time. The first of which is to address the tidal weir and levee structure. So repair that natural outflows and exchange with the tidal interface, and providing, building climate resilience at that site as well through doing so. You can see Elise standing at the tidal gate there. Second would just to deal with the existing drainage network in the central marsh area, as I said, really in an attempt to try to get retain that water in the landscape and improve the natural hydrology and landform. And lastly, it's to, and most excitingly, I think for us, is to, you've got these amazing opportunity to restore these adjacent freshwater wetlands, including Turner's Lagoon, that just create to that, add to that diversity of salt marsh and wetland diversity in that one spot. And all of these areas are now on the TLC reserve. And that's what Turner's Lagoon looked like in the 1940s imagery before it was drained in the 60s. And it would be amazing to restore that and have that as in the peripheral area of Burdens Marsh. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Anne Boothroyd. Anne's been working with TLC as the Barbara Thomas Fellow, and she's got the skills we need to wrangle a prioritisation metric to try to tell us what are the important parts of Tasmania we need to be looking after. She's worked in the Antarctic, just recently finished her PhD, and Anne will now give us her talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Hi, I'm Anne, and I've been working here at TLC with the support from the Nature Conservancy and the Barbara Thomas Foundation, and working to upgrade the TLC's conservation prioritisation system. So essentially the Conservation Prioritisation System, or CPS, is a set of spatial analysis tools that can be used to guide conservation investments and really ensure that TLC can strategically protect areas of high conservation value. So one of TLC's central goals is really to conserve and manage an additional 30,000 hectares of land in nature conservation by 2025, and a key target is to make sure that 25% of that is in the highest priority areas for conservation targets. So the TLC's, or the Conservation Prioritisation System, can help TLC achieve this by providing, by providing a model of priorities for achieving these targets across the state. So what the model really does is it combines or considers spatial data for species, habitat types, and other features that we care about, and together with planned conservation targets for these features, it selects areas across the state that are a priority that would meet those targets, but also considering the best practice conservation planning principles of CARE, so that's comprehensive, adequate, representative and efficient reserve system design. So this map here in the darker green areas shows the highest priority conservation areas across the state that TLC can use to support decision making around investments. So, for example, in TL or across TLC's programs across the state at the moment, we can establish the proportion of areas that are in the top or highest conservation priorities. So that's the 90th percentile of the results coming out of our model. And at the moment, TLC reserves, for example, we can see in this graph around 35% of TLC reserves are in that highest percentile category. Then in revolving fund properties and Midlands Conservation Program properties, we have actually over 50% of those properties are in the highest percentile category. So that's looking pretty good. So the CPS builds on the previous prioritisation tool that TLC had, which was the world-class reserve system. And really my role here at TLC has been to upgrade the system to make sure it's used to its full potential. So one of the first steps that we took was to revisit the planning region extent. So what we did was considered the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area and the adjacent reserves as conserved, and calculated the contribution that those conserved areas made to conservation targets, the statewide conservation targets, so that we could refine our prioritisation for the area that's really available for TLC to participate in, I guess, for conservation. Another really key update to the system was that we revisited the feature data, or the feature data representing all those things that we care about, to make sure it was up to date and that it included up-to-date records for both terrestrial and threatened species records and freshwater habitats as well. So we now have over 1,000 features considered in our model. So it's also been designed to be more flexible. So it's using Marksan conservation prioritisation software and takes the systematic conservation planning approach, and that allows for the system to be updated as new records or new data becomes available, such as from the TLC team in the field. And with that systematic conservation planning approach, it means that different planning scenarios can be explored in a way that's flexible, transparent, and a repeatable process. So we also designed the system to be more accessible. So I've set up workflows and tools for the TLC team to be able to then access the results, hopefully in a more straightforward way, and query, for example, for a property, what might be the priority level of that property and what features within that property might be driving a higher priority level. So why is the property important and what is its contribution to conservation feature targets? Finally, all of this hopefully is making the system more shareable with partners outside of TLC, so we can create and compare scenarios. And I'd just like to thank everyone at TLC for being amazing to work with. Thanks, Vanessa and Jorge. And on behalf of the Nature Conservancy, would really like to thank the Barbara Thomas Foundation for their generous support of this really fascinating project. Thank you.
The last two speakers are recipients of the TLC's Bird Conservation Fund. This was a scholarship that was set up, I think, in about 2017 to really encourage research on Tasmania's birds. Up until then, there was a real paucity of research and we knew very little about the birds in Tassie in a scientific way. This scholarship has kickstarted a whole range of fantastic projects, provides a financial stipend, and we've talked already about how desperate all researchers are for money, but to give often young students some money to buy gear or to pay for a conference or a trip is just such a kickstart for their work. So I'm looking forward to these next two presentations. The first one is this year's recipient. This is Jack Service. So congratulations, Jack. And Jack's title is Ecology of the Tasmanian Masked Owl, Insights from Acoustic and GPS Tracking. Welcome.
Before I begin, I acknowledge and pay respect to the Palawapakana people as the traditional and original owners and continuing custodians of my study sites in Lutruwita. My name is Jack, and today I'll be sharing some of my research on Tasmanian masked owls. My presentation will first begin by reviewing some of my honors research and then move on to my plans for my PhD. My supervisors are Amy Kosh and Jason Wiersma from the Forest Practices Authority, and Chris Johnson, Chris Burge, and James Pay at UTAS. So first, a bit of background on these birds. They're an endangered and endemic subspecies of Australian masked owl with a population estimate between 200 and 665 breeding pairs. Despite their concerning conservation status, we don't know very much about their ecology. There has been some previous research that's used a technique called call playback surveying, where researchers have gone out in the environment and broadcasted owl calls to see where these birds respond. And they can use these locations to try and model habitat occupancy at really broad spatial scales. For my honors project, I GPS tracked some of these birds to try and comment on habitat selection at a much finer spatial scale. So to track them, you first have to catch them. I caught 6 birds, 4 female and 2 male. You also can name them to keep track of birds better. We had a bit of a owl theme for the names at first, but our creativity ran out after about 3 birds. But if you look at, I believe, Owlecia, excuse me, you can actually see one of the tracking units. They're very small. They weigh only about 14 grams, and they were designed to fall off birds after a period of time. Here's what the tracking data looked like. Right off the bat, the points that are sort of a greenish yellow were points that were collected during the night and were broadly categorized as all active points. So any point that occurred during active behaviors. Whereas the points in blue are places where birds roosted and were therefore collected during the night or during the day. Right off the bat, we can also give TLC a big shout out because Betty's home range overlapped a large portion of Tinderbox Hills Reserve. The other thing you might notice is that Owlecia and Owlecia didn't produce very many GPS points and had very small home ranges. And when we first saw this, we were a little bit concerned, so we decided to go to these locations, and we actually found that we just weren't getting data from these birds because they were spending large amounts of time in nesting hollows, and the data just couldn't get out of the tree cavities. We installed cameras on these nests to try and record some nesting behaviors, and one of the cameras functioned long enough to actually get a whole breeding event. So this is a video from that camera. It was really cool to see that 2 of the birds we tracked successfully raised 2 chicks and gave us a lot of confidence that our research methods weren't too invasive. You can sort of see the second bird. It's a little bit further down there. To analyze the data, I essentially just compared the points that birds used to the points that were available to them. In this example, you can see the roost that Megan used in green and the roost she could have used in blue. You can then take these points and overlay them on different habitat variables. In this example, you can see a map of topographic protection, where things like gullies are really topographically enclosed and protected, and the tops of hills are more exposed. I repeated this with 4 different variables and looked at the active and roosting behaviors separately. And despite sort of spreading out the several different analyses, I wasn't able to observe any sample level selection for any of these variables or either behavior. And it was mostly just due to a large amount of variation in how different birds selected for different habitats. You would have some individuals select for some of these variables, but consistent selection did not occur, at least in the 4 birds that we had enough data to analyze. So moving forward, I haven't given up on the habitat selection stuff. I'll be hoping to track many more birds to try and give another stab at population level selection. And I'm also hoping to use GPS trackers that collect data much more frequently. If you can get 1 fix every minute or even multiple fixes in a minute, you can look at more fine-scale behaviors too, like hunting, perching, and even commuting, or some other behaviors that have been looked at in the same owl genus. I'm also hoping to look at some new habitat variables and really just get that big enough sample size to take another stab at some of the ones I've already looked at. I'm also really interested in looking at a new surveying technique for these owls called passive acoustic monitoring, or PAM. PAM involves going out in the environment and deploying these microphones, having them collect a large amount of audio, and then combing through the audio files to try and find owl vocalizations. And if you can do that, you can say owls are present at a location. And it's been really successful so far. Lots of recorders have recorded many, many owls, but we don't know exactly how effective it actually is or how it might be able to be improved to survey for owls better. So to answer some of these questions in my PhD, I'm really excited to try using a new technology called acoustic GPS tracking. And acoustic GPS tags are about the same size. They actually weigh a little bit less than the trackers I've already used. And they actually simultaneously collect on-owl audio and GPS track birds. And by lining up the time when a vocalization occurs and the time GPS points occur, you can actually get spatial observations of owl vocalizations. And using that, you can answer questions like where owl is calling. Maybe they're selecting acoustic habitat to better broadcast their vocalizations. You can also delineate an acoustic home range and compare that to the owl's total space usage. And then you might be able to say, well, if owls only call in 20% of their home range, then there's a pretty high probability that you wouldn't always detect them with passive acoustic monitoring. I'm also really interested in seeing what factors influence the detectability of calls. Things like vegetation density and topography can have an influence on sound propagation. I'm also really interested in looking at how distance plays a role in detectability. If you can make a distance-based detection function, you can actually apply that to other owl surveys, and you might be able to get actual abundance estimates with just PAM data. There's a lot of people to thank. I don't know if I have time to thank them all by name, but so many people have been involved with both my honors and my upcoming research that hopefully you can read through these points before I go to the next slide. Thank you.
Betty at Tinderbox Hills, I saw and heard that. We do not want the mast owl to be outshining 40 spotted pardalotes there, Jack, so watch out. Our last speaker of this session is Edith Shum. And for those of you who attended last year, you would have heard Edith give her first presentation. So she was the scholarship recipient last year. And the title of Edith's talk is There's No Place Like Home, Species as Place Markers in light of environmental change. Welcome, Edith.
Thanks, Sally. Hi everyone, my name is Edith and I'm a PhD student at UTAS under the School of Geography and Spatial Sciences. Today I just want to acknowledge country by paying my respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal communities, specifically to the Newinoni people in Lunawuni, Bruny Island, where I've conducted my research. So today I'll be talking about our connection to species on Bruny Island. And as Sally mentioned, if you were here last year, I introduced a concept called place attachment, or the bond that people have to places. In summary, I emphasize how there are many different ways in which we can form a bond to a place, specifically one being our connection to species in place. So, for example, I came to realize that my fascination with sea turtles has actually significantly shaped my connection to Australia. So I wanted to explore whether this relationship existed with other people, with other species. In other words, what role do species play in shaping our connection to special places? So with support from TLC, I focused my study on Bruny Island because of its unique wildlife, landscape, and accessibility to a wide range of people. So between March and April this year, I distributed a scoping questionnaire, which you may have seen around on Facebook or on Bruny Island or even on the radio. But basically in this survey, I basically asked two main questions. One is, which species do you feel most connected to on Bruny Island and why? So over a 1 month period, I received a total of 165 responses and an impressive list of 84 species. Now, before we get into the results, we all know that Bruny Island is particularly known for its unique wildlife. It's home to the 12 endemic Tassie birds and it hosts an often sold out bird festival. So you would think that the top listed species would be something unique to the island. Well, long and behold, the #1 listed species was actually Bennett's wallaby. And while there were a handful of mentions of the white wallaby in particular, the Bennett's wallaby was still the majority. And so this was followed by eastern quolls, then we have the fairy penguins, then the echidnas, then the 40-spotted pardalotes, the swift parrots, and finally the muttonbirds or shearwaters. So this was definitely not what I expected. So, what's so fascinating about the Bennett's wallaby? Well, when you look into the details a bit more, we do see it becomes quite clear that the species that people most often connect to is the one that they see the most often. So that being the ones that you see in your backyard. One even mentioned the fond memory of rescuing an injured wallaby. So it becomes quite clear that sheer quantity and presence does strengthen that bond we have to a species in place. And this is something that was also described with quolls and echidnas as well. Although it may seem obvious, this was really something I couldn't personally relate to because my connection to sea turtles was never because of its common presence in my life. I grew up in Canada and I never saw a sea turtle in person until I was in my 20s. So I grew up a lot seeing more of something like this. So this is interesting because it really shows that people associate meanings and values to a place is personal. And if we look at some of the other species that some participants described, you can see that with the beautiful firetail finch, they mentioned how it was like a welcome home party every time they came back. Or we look at the wattle trees and they would mention things like how the leaves and the winds make you aware of how isolated the island is. To the native cherry tree, where one participant explained they were used as Christmas trees growing up. To the she oaks and there's fallen needles in the forest floor, the texture of the bark, and to cowrie shells, which one mentioned how they've always collected it on the island and they were like little gifts offered from the island. So it's clear that there are a variety of factors at play. And so when we come back and look at the swift parrots and the 40-spotted pardalotes, we see that it's their conservation status and also how they're identified as an icon on the island that makes them special to the island. And what was interesting to highlight was though the explanations that we received for fairy penguins and muttonbirds, where they explicitly associated to the neck. on Bruny Island. And this was a key result because it really proves that people can connect to specific places because of a particular species. So what does this tell us? It tells us that species can be viewed as placemakers, a specific facet of a place that really contribute to shaping our own individual identities, meaning that people, the species you connect with is personal, and it may be as simple as having it around all the time to more personal experiences. And lastly, also suggests that species can be remind us about our values and that connection we have to specific places. So with this knowledge, I'm now focused on the next stage of my project on just fairy penguins and mountain birds at the neck. And it involves a more detailed questionnaire and interview. And so if anyone who wants to share their thoughts, please don't hesitate to come find me after the talk. What you have to say. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Edith. I was looking very closely at whether 40 spots outcompeted swift parrots. I think we did. Question time for the 6 speakers that we have just heard from. I'll start with a question that's come through online, but I'm hoping people may have some questions to follow on with. This is a question for Vishnu, and I will modify it a little bit because you're a salt marsh person. It relates to brush-tail possums and whether or not you have gathered any information about the impact of possums on salt marsh through browsing or grazing.
In the first study that we did, we didn't have any in Orielton Lagoon. We did have 1 or 2 in Marion Bay. So that wasn't particularly linked to browsing in the marsh per se. So the main issue we had was the rabbits and hare chewing on the plants. So I guess controlling rabbits and hares would be the priority. So we did pick up lots and lots of possums in Richmond. So I guess there's an order of magnitude difference in terms of the population there. So we'll be looking at how that differs to the other 2 sites we've got camera traps in and trying to see if that has a potential issue in this, on the salt marsh vegetation. I don't think so, but what I'd be concerned about is that we are doing planting in the buffer zone, and we're a bit worried about what that would do to the plantings in the buffer zone, which is more the terrestrial species that we're trying to reestablish in that area. Yeah.
And I've got a question for Edith. So Edith, I recently had an interaction around koalas and people's attachment to koalas. So interesting comparison. And I suppose my question is around the fact that the people you most likely get to answer your questions are going to be people who are highly motivated by nature. Whereas most Australians live in cities and are disjunct from nature. So with the koalas, they found that the people who most seem to care about koalas were Asian people who live in highly urbanized environments and were willing to actually spend a lot of money on koalas, but they don't have an access to nature. So I wondered about what that means for Tasmania or support for Tasmanian species, whether or not there's another part to your study which is about how disjunct or related people are to nature, and whether as we get less connected to nature, we're going to be less able to make that connection like you suggest.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question, loaded question. I think there's a few ways to look at it. One that you mentioned about how if you're living in a city, it's different for how you connect to species. Interesting enough, I did actually talk to one participant who was from Brisbane, and he was really into iNaturalist. So I think with technology now, there are ways for us to use it to connect to nature. And he was actually someone who was very I spent an hour talking to him, and he was actually one of the most passionate participants because even though he lived in the city in Brisbane and only been to Bruny Island 2 times, the knowledge he knew on the island was far greater than some of the other people I've spoken to. So I think technology is a big thing that can be used as an advantage to us. I think the other thing to note also is the presence of species, as I mentioned. A lot of people I've talked to have not seen a lot of fairy penguins at the neck as well. And that in a way has strengthened their connection as well. So sometimes that lack of a presence or knowing that a species is declining could actually help us in a way and help us, get together and really look at the consequences of what it will happen if we don't band together.
I'll just take another online question, and it's for Beck. Beck, what's the time period for restoration at Burdens Marsh?
Thanks, Sally. I feel like I should have someone from TLC answer that one. But as you can see, there are quite a lot of, and I was surprised when we mapped those drains just how extensive the current drainage network is. So it'll be a work in progress over time. I think it's great that the TLC are willing to embark on that process, and we're actually hoping to kick off works at the number one priority at the tidal outlet structure this coming summer, autumn. So I think those progressive steps will be worked through as budgets and resources allow over the years to come.
Don't go away, Beck. My question is also about the restoration of Burdens Marsh. Do you have a practical and a physical plan? That is it best to block the drains or completely fill them in? And if there's earthworks involved, how are you going to ameliorate erosion and dispersal of the solids? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. There is somewhat a physical plan in place to guide these works. We have now undertaken similar restoration works at another TLC property at Long Point on the east coast at Malting Lagoon. So we have, we've now been restoring wetlands and salt marsh around Australia, particularly the southeast Australia, for the last 11, 12 years now. So we've got quite a range of sites under our belts and experience. And as I said, we've demonstrated some of that in Tassie now. There will be earthworks involved, as they were at Long Point. But the footprint that I guess there's an acceptance that there's a short-term disturbance to change the trajectory for a long-term outcome. And that has been accepted, and we work within the existing drainage footprint. We're lucky at Burdens Marsh. One of the other things we did when we mapped those drains was to record how intact the spoil banks are alongside those drains. And many of them, there's over 80% of the spoil still there. So it will be as simple as just moving along with an earth mover and pushing those back in. Where they're not intact and we've got, nothing remaining or small bits we will be looking at putting in blocks in those drains just to hold that water up in the landscape. I think the types of soils there, given those drains have been there since 1820, even those ones in the middle, erosion has not been a problem over time. They don't appear to probably have got much deeper or erosive. So I don't think those soils are particularly prone to erosive processes. So, but yeah, they're certainly things we take into consideration. Thanks.
More questions? Yes.
Another question. It's just about other potential perverse outcomes, and I guess I'm thinking about probably weeds, introduced species being able to grow better in those areas.
Yep, sure. And again, other really important considerations. And from what we've seen, and I guess as I said, we've had quite an extensive period of restoration now, and watching places like other salt marsh communities at Long Point track back. Water is an amazing restorative tool, and that's why I love working in wetlands, particularly because they're so dynamic. And anything that comes into contact with water at the, below the high water mark, usually will look after itself and restore pretty quickly. Anything above that, obviously in the terrestrial zone, you might, definitely be looking at weed management and things like that. What we saw at Long Point, probably the first 12 months, some of the weeds those early colonized species move in. We had to work with TLC and others to say, just be patient, just give that a year or two and wait. And what we're seeing already in the second year at Long Point, the salt marsh is out competing those, the thistles are gone, and salt marsh is back to, at some places, almost 70-80% cover already within 2 years. So these systems are very forgiving. They do respond really quickly, especially if you get some wet years that sort of spur that on. So we haven't had a massive issue, but sometimes you just need to give them some time to do their thing as well.
And this one's for Edith. Hello. I'm interested in the relationship of people to place through plants, which have been noticeably absent today in all of the talks. And I know that you mentioned a few, but plants are, you know, we're with them all the time. They're just there, whereas all these birds and animals kind of come and go. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, and is it just that people take them for granted, whereas they're actually the foundation of all of these other creatures' world?
Yeah, it's interesting you note that. I would say that, so I've done a literature review on this topic and trying to find out what kind of species were present in the current literature, and there are actually quite a few papers specifically on plants, and a lot of the relationship with plants is due to cultural values as well. And I think it's just something that I think maybe because it's so obvious that not many people it's not something you think of off the bat, but I think especially in countries where there's lots of cultural ties to plants, that's a bit more known. So I think that's definitely something worth looking into a bit more. And something I found interesting just on the side note is that some invasive plants actually people are more attached to in some ways, because even though they know it's invasive, because it makes up their environment, they actually are much more like connected to that species because of that. So that's also another interesting lens to look at it.
We'll wind this session up now. We'll have a break and reconvene at 3:30. Please thank the 6 speakers we've had in this session.